It's baffled scholars for 2 millennia. It is a puzzle made of multi-dimensional elements, an enigma with roots that reach back to the dawning of time, perhaps before. Daniel explained part of it. Ezekiel and Isaiah had glimpses into it. John saw it all for the time of the end. That time is now. Join Derek and Sharon Gilbert on a journey that spans the course of history, from Eden to Mount Hermon, from Hermon to Babel, from Babel to Rome, from Rome to the cross, and from there to us. Biblical prophecy is coming true before your eyes, and to understand it, you must discern the times both then and now. It's time to unravel the threads of this all-encompassing prophetic paradox. It's time to unravel Revelation.
Welcome to Unraveling Revelation. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and we're on take 4 of this show, but it's because we're a little goofy today. But we love having you join us in our home. And soon, this studio will be out in the newly renovated barn, all because you guys have helped. And we'll tell you more about that after the break. But for now, we're in Isaiah.
That's right. We're back to Isaiah as we continue with our long detour leading up to the Mystery Babylon discussion, or Babylon the Great in the book of Revelation.
And I think it's an important discussion. There's a lot of, debate about exactly who is Mystery Babylon, what is it happening? Is it a city? Is it a person? What is it? Well, we need some backstory before we actually examine that.
Right. And our take on this is this. We see value in many of the interpretations of Mystery Babylon, but the one thing we need to remember is that it is a supernatural entity.
Yes.
And so we need to try to understand what was in the mind of John the Apostle when he wrote Revelation, or when it was revealed to him by the Holy Spirit.
What was in his mind? What was the context and the beliefs of those people who received those letters?
Exactly. What did they know, and when did they know it, to borrow a popular phrase from our political culture here. But the bottom line is that they understood that there was more going on in the spirit realm than we do in the modern day. And so there's a tendency, I think, among prophecy scholars to look for natural interpretations, which is certainly not, that's not wrong. That's not wrong, because certainly these things will play out in the natural realm.
Yes.
But we also need to look at the players behind the scenes.
Right. It's trying to look for a black hole.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily see the black hole, but you see the effects around it.
The effect on the,
So we'll see the effects in the natural realm, but we may not, those who are here to witness it, may not immediately know and recognize that it's a spirit entity. Well, last time we talked about Osiris.
Right. And this relates to our discussion that revolved around Ashur, the chief god of Assyria, who is also known by many other names: Enlil to the Akkadians and Babylonians, El to the Canaanites, Saturn to the Romans, Kronos to the Greeks, Baal-Hamon to the Phoenicians, Molech to the Hebrews, but also Shemiyaza, we believe, the one who led the rebellion, described very briefly in Genesis chapter 6. We also think he is Abaddon and Apollyon of Revelation 9. It's one entity by many different names.
And he may actually be referred to in the Old Testament.
Well,
that loathed branch?
Yeah, and that's what kind of led down this path here as we were discussing Isaiah chapter 14, and that very strange reference in, I believe that's verse 19. I've got chapter 10 of Isaiah brought up here, but I'm going to switch back to 14 very quickly. And of course, that's the very famous chapter that in your King James will read, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of dawn, son of the morning." In Hebrew, Hillel ben Shachar, which is how we connect this entity from Hillel to Enlil, which is the Akkadian form of Enlil, who again is all of these other entities. Isaiah 14:19 is the verse that you are cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch.
Yes.
And this is based on this translation is based on the assumption that the word translated branch, netzer, is the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch. But in Egyptian, there is a homonym, sounds exactly the same, but it's a different word, like deer and deer. That means dead or divinized dead god, which was a term, netzer, in the Egyptian that was often applied to the god of the underworld, Osiris. And that's how we get to Osiris here, and why we're taking this little detour here because there was a lot of, especially in the time of Isaiah and Hezekiah, a lot of cross-pollination, if you will, between the kingdom of Judah and the Egyptians and their religion, because Hezekiah was trying to depend on the Egyptians for help against the rising power of Babylon. And of course, that didn't work out well because about 125 years later, Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple, sacked Jerusalem, and carried off a lot of the Judeans to Babylon.
You know what I find interesting about Isaiah 14 is that in verse 3, you get, this is after verses 1 and 2, where you see a restoration, a return of Jacob into the land. It says, and when Yahweh has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. And it gets into this whole, a taunt section that then clearly moves into a supernatural realm.
Yeah. And as we discussed the last couple of weeks, this phrase in Hebrew translated king of Babylon, Melech Babel, can also mean king of the God gate. And so given that Babylon was not really a political power in the time of Isaiah, that was still about a century in the future from Isaiah. Yes, he may have been prophesying, and probably was another already but not yet prophecy. Yes, Babylon will rise up and oppress the Jews. But I think when you consider the possibility that they're talking about that entity who was buried at the God gate or who was in the abyss, who wanted to return through the Bab El or Bab Elu, the God gate, that's where we get to this Asher, Enlil, El, Molech, this underworld entity, and that gets us back to Isaiah 14:19.
And will eventually take us to this entity in Revelation, the whore of Babylon, who controls a God gate.
Right. So there are a lot of ideas at play here, and we admit that we're seeing into this realm as though into a glass darkly.
Oh, absolutely, with not even my corrective lenses on. It's really, really tough to see, but we're doing our best. And we know that you guys, many of you have wonderful ideas as well, and you've told us about them. And so we always read that and try to take that into account.
Yeah.
We read a lot of sources.
We do, and we're just trying to synthesize this into a way that makes sense, while understanding we're probably going to be wrong about a lot of this, because just as the apostles who learned directly from Jesus for 3 years didn't really understand the point of his first coming. They thought he was going to be the conquering Messiah then in the first century. We're probably not understanding all of the signs of his second coming any better than Peter and John and Andrew and Philip, etc.
Which is why we try not to be dogmatic about a lot of things. We're dogmatic about very few things. Virgin birth, Jesus dying for our sins, rising on the third day,
literally
coming again.
Coming back from the dead.
Yeah. So Isaiah 14.
So who is Osiris then? If we're looking at this loathed branch, that word in Hebrew in Isaiah 14:19, netzer, being a loan word from Egyptian, which makes sense. Again, they found scarabs dated to the time of Hezekiah in Jerusalem because, again, he was trying to make nice with the king of Egypt, political alliance instead of relying strictly on Yahweh. This divinized dead god, and that helps make sense of this whole context of Isaiah 14, where the Rephaim rise up in Sheol and greet this divine rebel who's thrown out of Eden. Oh, look, you're just as weak as we are. You are cast out away from your grave in Isaiah 14:19, like a loathed, divinized dead god or divinized corpse or dead god, like Osiris, this god of the underworld. In the Egyptian art, he's always depicted as a mummy, completely wrapped except for his face, which is green because he's, dead.
And the story of the green man is repeated in the idea of life coming from death, which is that ancient story of resurrection. And Hernunos is a green man. We've got a number of green deities throughout the world. It's interesting that he's cast out of his grave. Now, Osiris isn't necessarily depicted as a rising and dying god.
No.
He's just dead.
Yeah. That's the key difference here. And the other clues in here that we're connecting Osiris to this entity known to the Semitic people who lived in Mesopotamia and the Levant, in other words, the ancient Near East, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. As we mentioned last week, the epithet of Dagon, who was the version of this entity, Enlil, El, Molech, etc., along the Euphrates River, Dagon's epithet was Bel Pagre, or Lord of the Corpse, or Lord of the Corpse Offering. So this, I think, in Isaiah 14:19 is a polemic against this entity, but connecting him to Osiris is really, really intriguing. Osiris is one of the most important gods of the Egyptian pantheon. He was, his name actually is Usir in Egyptian. Osiris is the Greek form of the name, but the name apparently means foremost of the Westerners, with the West being the land of the dead. In other words, foremost among the dead.
Here's an interesting tidbit that I discovered about Osiris. No one knows for sure where he's buried. There are a number of places that are considered his burial place. And so there are those in Egypt that are trying to find him.
Right.
As if somehow a mystical act will begin, a new age will begin, if you can just find Osiris. One of the places he's thought to have been buried is in Elephantine Island. Is that it? Another place is possibly Abu Sir, which is of Usir.
Yeah, and that is that was the center of his cult, or that's where his cult began, actually. It spread from there in the Nile Delta to the south to Abydos, or actually it's the syllables on the second, it's Abydos, Abydos. And that became the center of his cult. That's kind of halfway down the Nile, if I remember my geography correctly. But he was the one who was murdered by his brother. He was like the king of the world and was killed by his brother Set.
Yes, well, let's get to that in a minute. I want to stay with Abusir. Abusir.
Right.
Whether it's Ab or Av, but I wonder if etymologically, because the Semitic languages and the Egyptian languages sort of shared things back and forth, if it gets into this idea of an Ov.
Well, that's a really
like
good
a
idea.
Ritual pit.
Yeah, Ov being the name for the ritual pit. This derives from ancient Hurrian, but that's the word in Hebrew, Ov,
And
usually
it's
translated
similar
as
to
medium.
Abyss.
Right. It's the origin.
Exactly.
The ancient Hurrian is the same word from which the Sumerians get Abzu, from which we get the Greek word that means
so
abyss.
Is this the ritual place where you commune with Osiris?
Well, I think that is, I think that's a really good interpretation of it, because certainly he was the Lord of the underworld. He, after his death, did not return, although there is the story of...
Just so you know, when we say he was the Lord of the underworld, these are the stories.
Right.
Bear in mind the fallen realm lie.
Yes, absolutely.
So these are the stories they want humans to believe.
Yeah.
They basically want Kronos to come back. However, they have to spin him.
Right. Yeah, he's portrayed as the one who will return and bring back a golden age. And the story, of course, was after his assassination by his brother Set and 72 co-conspirators, which is significant because that's the number of, completion, the number of all of them. In other words, the complete set, not one left out. All of the gods of the nations conspired with Set to kill him. Isis reconstructed him except for his missing phallus, which she reconstructed magically and then created the god Horus.
This sounds similar to other stories that we've heard in Greek mythology and Semitic mythology about a son killing a father or a brother killing a brother.
Right. Well,
I want your job, so I'm getting rid of you.
Yeah, even, Cain and Abel, which, of course, skeptics will look at and say, well, see, the Hebrews just copied that from other religions. Like, no, the fallen realm is copying the true story.
Absolutely. And the idea of a god returning, that's another copy. Rising and dying god, that's yet another copy. A shepherd coming back, another copy. But Osiris had a sister wife named Isis.
Right. And she reconstructed, she found 13 of the 14 missing pieces. And again, that last piece she reconstructed through magical arts and then used that to impregnate herself and give birth to the god Horus. Who
turned herself into a hawk of some kind and sort of fluttered over him and suddenly which may be why Horus is depicted
as a hawk.
having
And that's
a
interesting
hawk
because
head.
in the Canaanite, the text from Ugarit, the spirits, especially spirits of the dead, were depicted as birds, flitting about.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, again, a number of ideas that seem to fit together, although we can't really draw one-to-one correlations. You try to do that with these texts from the ancient world, you go crazy.
It's one reason we don't do charts. But one of the things about this story is that it isn't a pure story. You get people coming in and borrowing elements of it and then bringing in their own. It's called syncretism. And you get a lot of syncretistic religions throughout the world. Well, frankly, Catholicism borrows from the beliefs of the locals and adapts them to the new religion when they bring it in, and they Catholicize everything. And so you'll have elements regionally where certain pageantry takes place that isn't necessarily Catholic doctrine.
It is why we get such really odd things in the American South. The elements of the Yoruba religion mixed with things from the Caribbean, mixed with Roman Catholicism.
And you get Mesoamerican things that are thrown in with Catholicism. So that's not unusual. All civilizations do that, which is another reason it's so difficult to have a chart.
Yeah. And the reason we're bringing all of this in is because there was an influence on the Hebrews who were, and the Jews who were pulled into some of these false pagan religions of their neighbors.
And John understood that.
And John understood that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The idea of the Ove and the spirits of the dead, the Ovoth. That's what I was looking for here while I was tapping away. Because I wrote about this in the second coming of Saturn, but I'm at an age now where I don't remember exactly what it was I wrote.
I'll say again, if I can remember who I am and who I'm married to when I wake up in the morning, that's a win.
But the point is that we're looking at Isaiah 14 as a condemnation of this deity worshipped by many names throughout the centuries, who was believed by all of these cultures to be somehow in the netherworld, banished to the netherworld, or king of the netherworld, is the same one who's coming out of the bottomless pit in the book of Revelation. And there's a connection between him and Inanna, or Mystery Babylon.
Yes. More about that after the break. Hey, guess what month it is? And that's why maybe we're wearing red, white, and blue.
It's July.
It's July, which means not only that, the United States celebrates Independence Day, but also anniversary of something big.
Yes, the 1947 Roswell crash, which occurred over 4th of July weekend.
It did. In fact, in 2017, you and I and Josh Peck all went to Roswell to see exactly what happened and get some expert interviews. And then you wrote a book.
Yes, Josh and I wrote the book, The Day the Earth Stands Still, about the phenomenon, because for many people, the UFO phenomenon is not about figuring out how we can travel to the stars. It is really a religion, answering the big questions of life. Why are we here? Where did we come from? What happens when we die?
And it is back in the news. So that is the main reason we've decided to bring back a special from last summer. If you get this book, and you will get these two practically free.
Yes.
Because the whole package, you're going to save $30.
Yes.
It's only $35 for all three. You get the book, the two Sci-Friday crazy.
Best of deals is 14 hours of video on the between the two Best of Sci-Friday. And we do address the UFO phenomenon on some of these episodes. $35 plus shipping and handling, available now only at our store online, gilberthouse.org/store. Welcome back to Unraveling Revelation. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and we are thankful to every one of you, not just for watching and telling your friends about it, but for also downloading the app. If you want to make sure you always get content from Gilbert House, Unraveling Revelation, Gilbert House Fellowship, whatever it is, download the app, because the day will come when these free services were on their playground and they may just kick us out.
Yeah. They have a tendency to do that. They've gone back and looked at, some of the things that I've posted on my podcast, which is connected to our YouTube channel.
Or they can just say something happened that never did. They don't have to give you a reason.
They don't.
I know that's, again, this is their playground. So we're not going to complain about that.
Right.
We do want you to download the app. It's put together and kept going by a Christian company called Subsplash. They're a wonderful company if you are a church or an organization and you want an app like ours. go to Subsplash. They're
Right.
very reasonably priced.
Absolutely.
We also want to thank you for helping out with Build Barn Better. You can go to gilberthouse.org/donate. And while you're there, take a look at our travel and think about going to Israel with us.
Oh, yeah. Life-changing event next spring. We'll be there with Timothy Alberino. 2025, the Iron and Myth Tour of Israel with Doug Van Dorn, Judd Burton, and details always at gilberthouse.org/travel.
Indeed. Now, Osiris and...
Yeah, this was something that we... that connects to what we opened the program with. The Egyptian loanword in Isaiah 14:19, Netzer, meaning divinized, dead god, connected to Osiris. The scholar who wrote that paper, Christopher B. Hayes, he's at Fuller Theological Seminary, or was at least when he wrote these papers, wrote another one that I found fascinating, this one with a co-author named Joel Lamon. And they suggest that there's another loan word in Hebrew, although I would argue that this one went from Hebrew into Egyptian, and I'll explain why. The Egyptian cognate to the Hebrew word ovoth, which literally means spirits of the dead.
Right.
In Egyptian means a dead ancestor who could be represented through an image. In other words...
Like a teraphim.
Right. The dead ancestors who were represented by the teraphim in those monthly rituals. You had to summon them by name. You'd smear bread on the statue to feed it. They argue that, and it's a technical argument that I barely understand. We won't get into it here. The bottom line is that that word, ovoth, in Egyptian meant the same thing as it meant in Hebrew, essentially, the spirits of the dead ancestors, ovoth. And that's connected to Ov, the ritual pit through which you would summon spirits from the netherworld, but also connected to this idea of the fathers, as in Av, the fathers, or Abi.
Right.
That whole idea, the fathers, the spirits of the dead, and this ritual pit to summon them from the netherworld was all connected etymologically. Now, they argue that the Egyptian word led to the Hebrew word, but as a scholar named Harry Hofner showed back in the 1960s, the original word Ov in Hebrew comes from an older Hurrian word, Abi, which was the name of that ritual pit. So actually, I think this is a case where the Hebrew is the original and it was transferred into Egyptian.
And it may even go back further.
Yes.
We can't really tell yet, but it's an interesting idea that this is all about communing with what they believed were the dead ancestors, but these are actually Elohim. They are fallen entities that communicate with their kids, with demons. And if you don't know what demons are, they are the spirits of the Nephilim, the giants that were created when these fallen angels, Elohim, entered into women. They said, hey, you're pretty, let's go. And they had children, these women. And how they had them, we don't know. We're not going to get into that. We just believe the Bible that they had giant children that were half angel. And because of that, they died in the flood, but their spirits were released to roam the earth. And according to the book of First Enoch, that first section, first 36 chapters called the Book of Watchers, they were condemned to wander the earth, tormenting humanity without incurring any punishment on themselves until the final judgment, at which time they would be judged. Which is why Legion was so upset. Yes, it is not yet our time. Right, yeah. Well, going back to Isaiah chapter 10, which we had talked about previously, and this I think is really interesting. And full disclosure, we're kind of out on a limb alone here because I haven't found any scholarly support for this. Yeah, we'll cut this off behind us. That as we talked about Assyria and the name Ashur referring both to Assyria, but also to the Assyrian form of this entity, Enlil, El, Molech, Ashur. It may be etymologically connected to the Egyptian name for Osiris, Usir. Yes, and that's how we ended up on Osiris in the first place. I think that's fascinating. Yeah. Osiris is talked about a lot lately. NASA even named its little recent probe, yes, Osiris Rex. Well, and that was really interesting because they really had to twist the acronym around to come up with Osiris Rex. Yeah. But the idea of resurrection or returning from the dead is part of the myth, the story, the religion of the Egyptians around Osiris. There is a scholar who in the 1880s, a scholar named Lagarde, who believed that in Isaiah 10 verse 4, which reads in the ESV, nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners
or fall among the slain. For all this, his anger has not turned away, and his hand is still stretched out. Talking about.
What verse is that?
That's Isaiah 10, verse 4.
Okay, got it.
And backing up to verse 3, what will you do on the day of punishment in the ruin that will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth? This is essentially God's coming judgment. Nothing remains but to crouch among the prisoners. Well, that word translated prisoners is Asir, and Lagarde, or Delagarde actually, argued that the word Asir, prisoner, should be Osir, and that the word meaning, the word translated nothing, Bilti, should be Belit, which was an Egyptianized form of Bel or Baal.
Uh-huh.
Baal crouches with Osiris and falls among the slain. Now, there's really not much support for this among scholars today, but this was again proposed 140 years ago almost by a French scholar.
In the Septuagint, it's a little bit different. I'm going to back up to verse 3. And what will they do in the day of visitation? For affliction shall come to you from afar, and to whom will ye flee for help? And where will ye leave your glory, that ye may not fall into captivity? For all this, his wrath is not turned away, but his hand is yet exalted. A little different.
Yeah. The translation by the Jewish scholars in the 3rd century BC, suggesting that they understood that the word was asir, prisoners or captives or into captivity. But given the broader context here, with the possibility of Egyptian loanwords being brought into Hebrew.
Into Isaiah in particular, because we've seen another one already. Right.
And then when you follow in verse 5 of Isaiah 10, you get, woe to Ashur, the rod of my anger.
Yes.
Woe to Assyria, probably. But when you get down to Isaiah 14, and again, you get that cross between the king of the God gate, Molech Babel, and Ashur in the netherworld, where the Rephaim rise up to greet this divine rebel. It's possible that we're seeing a reference here to Osiris, the Egyptian form of this same entity, who is now in the netherworld, but through various religions, the Egyptians believing that Isis propagated through the magic ritual, that Osiris would someday return from the dead. His later cult, by being merged with the Apis bull into Serapis by the Romans and Greeks.
We're never going to get through all this. We're down to 30 seconds.
I know. But we will bring this home next week as we get to Isaiah's prophecy of the ultimate destruction of these watchers, the watcher class entities, and then finally move back to Revelation and Mystery Babylon, the whore of Babylon.
I've got a lot to say.
Oh, yeah. Don't miss it. We're getting into the really good stuff, and we thank you for watching. This is Unraveling Revelation.
Unraveling Revelation is a viewer-supported outreach of Gilbert House Ministries. Follow us online at unravelingrevelation.tv and gilberthouse.org. That's where you'll find our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship. We'd love to hear from you. Contact us through our websites or drop us a line at P.O. Box 78, Crane, Missouri 65633.